Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV 9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator today, Karl Cassell, President and CEO of Horizons, a Family Service Alliance. A good friend of mine in high school, as we were having a discussion in AP English, as we were discussing history and politics, made a comment to me that has always resonated with me throughout my adult years, and that is, the winners of the war write history. This is usually a very true statement until we consider our own country's Civil War. Many of the fallen heroes of the Confederacy are memorialized around the country, reenactments happen regularly, and the narrative is still being shaped today. We are going to explore how the battle flag that the Confederacy marched during a war over a century ago still seems to be causing controversy amongst populations in our country. Some would call the recent press over flying the Confederate flag merely a distraction, while others fear the connotations that are associated with it, and others see it as a harmless way to express their Southern pride and heritage. Today, I have with me, to my immediate left, Dedric Buckaloo, Shuttleworth Associate Professor of History at Cole College. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Karl.
Next to him, we have Dedric Doolin, President of the local chapter in NAACP.
Good morning.
And on the end, Sherman Lundy, Iowa Division of the Sons of the Confederate Veteran. Good
and
morning.
Also a member of the Cedar Valley Civil War Roundtable.
Yes, and also a member of the Cedar Valley. I want to spend a couple minutes first discussing a local issue that is kind of bubbled up amongst some high school kids and has galvanized the community. And that is the high school student bringing a Confederate flag to Vinton High School. So if each of you could just comment on why you think this is getting pressed today, should it get pressed, and how can it be resolved? And one of you can start.
Well, I think the context has to be the massacre at the church in Charleston and the decisions in the South to remove the Confederate emblem from state Capitol grounds. That's, of course, happened in South Carolina and happened in Alabama. Mississippi has the emblem as part of its state flag and has a debate going on now about that. That seems to be the context where, or in which these students, it started with one student and then spread to some others, decided to use the Confederate emblem and take it to school. That put them at loggerheads with the administration, which was trying to kind of keep controversial things from coming to school. In a certain sense, it might be high school students kind of acting out, but by the same token, there are reports from Vinton that some mailboxes were destroyed at the home of an African-American family after that, which speaks to the fact that for some, if not all people, the emblem is problematic and symbolizes racism and vexed racial relations, even here in Iowa.
Well, I got a few calls on this, and so, I mean, I just know that there were some students that were uncomfortable going to school, and that was a concern. You know, it was more than one mailbox, so it was several mailboxes, and from what I'm understanding is the truck and vehicles that went by were flying the Confederate flag and also using the N-word, according to some witnesses. So I think the reality is there's mixed feelings about the flag, you know, and that's where the confusion comes in. You know, the flag has, to some people, the flag has some historic perspectives, and I think it is part of history. But as you were saying earlier, history really is about who's telling the story. You know, growing up as an African American, I've always understood that the story hasn't always been straight and clear, and all the details haven't been there. But there is some emotion involved. You know, even if the intent is not there, you know, the fact that some people are feeling unsafe and feeling threatened is a concern, and we as a community need to take that concern seriously because of the potential dangers of someone getting harmed and injured, and not just physically, but also emotionally.
Well, I have to tell you, what I know about it is what I saw on the news in terms of looking at that. information. And there are two things that come to mind. And what you said, I guess I would agree with to the large extent. When you use the Confederate flag, and I'm kind of a stickler for that, you're talking about the battle flag, because
Right.
there were many, many flags.
Right.
There were national flags and unit flags and so forth. So we're talking
Not
about,
even the official battle flag of the Confederacy,
Right.
but an important flag that was
Yeah.
flown over Lee's troops and others.
yeah, well, that was generally the battle flag on the Eastern Front over there. There were many over there. It was an adaptation of the St. Andrew's Cross from Scotland. But to address that, I see that as a scenario whereby you have people, if they're going to rebel, they're going to defy something. What kinds of symbols do you have that are rebels or defying something? And so what they choose to do is to use that flag as a symbol of whatever it is they want to defy. For those of us that view that with a historical perspective, we look at that with chagrin, because as far as I'm concerned, when you use that for a negative purpose, you defile that flag under which those men who went off to fight were honorable men. And I regard that as an abomination, and it's a misuse of that flag at any time by anybody over there. And anybody can take a symbol and use it for any kind of degradation, and it's unfortunate that you pick that symbol over there, because it is threatening when you use it in that manner.
But of course, just to follow up on that, this is not a randomly chosen symbol in a lot of cases where it's used
Yes.
for racial purposes.
Right.
It dates from the Civil War, which of course has a lot to do with slavery, and of course that is an important element of why it's picked up later. And then it of course has a long history. I mean, it has its history back to the 1860s, but it's utilized throughout the 20th century over and over and over by people who have a white supremacist ideology. It's conceivable we can see that as unfortunate, but it carries a lot of baggage with it, earned baggage over many, many decades, from the Dixiecrats in 1948, who leave the Democratic Party over the civil rights plank, to its use in the 50s and the 60s, basically as a symbol of massive resistance in the South to the civil rights movement. So it isn't just that it has rebel associations. It also clearly has racist associations. That might be unfortunate, but they exist. And so to utilize the flag in that way, is going to be deeply problematic to people who know that history. So.
And when you look at I read the newspaper articles about an hour ago, and you look at, there was also the word white power was also used, and the N-word was also used. But if you know a little bit about the history of Vinton, you also know that there was a time when Vinton was considered the Iowa headquarters for the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people didn't know that. A lot of people, but because I've been in the civil rights struggle for a while, I've gotten calls about that. And in recent times, I've gotten calls about other issues in Vinton that had nothing to do with the flag, but just had to do with race issues. So, they're clearly, race is still an issue, and this country hasn't truly dealt with it. And that's why, it does deserve some coverage in the news, but as a community, we need to address this issue. When we need to address it openly and honestly, and what that really means. Even, to me, out of respect, anything that endangers anyone is a concern. I think the flag has a proper position in history, museums, and that sort of place. I don't have any problem with that. But when people are fearing for their life or fearful of things, I have concern about that being put in their face and the emotions it causes.
Well, I have a bunch of questions, but let me start back, because we all mentioned the Civil War, we've mentioned the 1860s. Was the fundamental tenet of the Civil War to preserve slavery, in your opinion?
No. There's we only have a short time to address that. Essentially, in terms of the history, when Lincoln calls out the 75,000 volunteers to go down south to put down the rebel colonies and support. From the rebel point of view, if you want to call it that, they seceded, they formed a country, pretty much like they thought their ancestors did in the Revolutionary War. Lincoln calls out those volunteers to go down and do what? It was not to free the slaves. It was to bring these recalcitrant individuals back into the Union. Now, you trace that history for the secession, and when you look at the concept of slavery, the conflict is really over not so much the slavery, and I think the North was probably willing to let the Deep South have the slavery without too much interference, so long as they did not have to encounter that situation. But when they encountered that situation in Kansas, and you have bloody Kansas, what's bloody Kansas all about? It's about the expansion of slavery into the territories, and you have that conflict that exists. And there was an excellent comment several years ago from an African-American professor of history at Charleston University when he was asked about the moral issue. And he looked at the narrator and said, no. He said, if you want to look at that expansion issue, it was all about the economics of slavery. And to that extent, there is where that division starts. That is where that problem is. And from our perspective, looking at that, when you look at slavery, the issue, you look at slavery, the issue, the expansion of that issue as a problem, and you look at the economics of that issue very deeply as a concern. When the Union troops went off to fight, what did they go off to fight to do? To bring the states back and preserve the Union. That was it. When the Southern states went off to fight, and we know that, only about 5–10% of the actual members of the Confederate Armed Forces owned slaves over there. It doesn't make slavery any more odious, and I'm not here to defend that by any stretch of the imagination. But realistically, these people who were Southern soldiers looked at their homes as being defiled by the Union hordes coming down south to tell them what to do. And so they're going to respond to protect home and family. So I think you have the issue over here when you have to look at slavery as driving the secession in terms of the economics over here. But you look at that war, and eventually what happened with Lincoln is that Lincoln, I think, was forced to deal with that issue. He was forced to deal with the issue from his abolitionist Congress. He was forced to deal with the issue with the fact that at home, slaves were doing the work to allow the soldiers to come to the front. Then also he had issues in terms of the diplomacy with England and France over here. So he was forced to confront that issue. So to that extent, I guess that's a rather long answer, but that's in part some of the kinds of things that we see.
Well, there's a lot in that answer, but I do feel like I need to go ahead and respond to it. He's absolutely right that when the Union begins to fight, they are not fighting to abolish slavery or end slavery, and there are certainly limits to the moral condemnation of slavery in the North at the beginning of the war. But I don't think that gets to why the vast majority of historians would tell you that slavery is absolutely at the base of the Civil War, and that has to do with the choice to secede. The first states that go out, led by South Carolina, leave in December of 1960. In the month 1860, I'm sorry, the month after Lincoln is elected. And they are leaving not for states' rights in an abstract way or any other reason, but because in order to maintain the right to continue to keep slavery. It is true that the Republican Party was not going to move into the states and remove it, but the issue was about the expansion of slavery. And for the firebrands in South Carolina, that was enough. Lots of the documents, the statements of secession by various states make clear that an important element of why they are leaving is that they believe wholeheartedly in white supremacy, they believe wholeheartedly in slavery, and they are leaving for the purpose of attempting to hold on to that system. So to argue that the Union doesn't go to war for that reason is, I think, slightly misleading, because the only conceivable way to understand the secession of the southern states is not just an abstract state right, but the right to maintain the institution of slavery.
Well, and I think the reality, though, I think that is that, you know, those of us who have studied this for a long time, and you know, I originally went to school to be a history major, but you know, history does tell you that slavery was involved in that process. Now, even the run-up to the war, right? But did it impact economics? Oh yeah, it impacted economics. There's no question about it that economics was part of it, because slavery was based on, you know, economics. There's a whole lot of economics there, but you know, slavery became a real race-based issue, and that's where the problem came in. But slavery was definitely part of the issue with the Civil War. There's no question. You can't eliminate that piece of it.
Certainly.
And there is no question, let me just say, that in the wake of the war, it's been relatively easy for Northerners to congratulate themselves on their moral position about slavery, and of course to suggest that the South was out of step in some way or something like that. The fact of the matter is, race and the challenges of race relations and racism, this is an American issue. It takes different forms in different places, but it's an American issue, and it's far too easy to sort of nod one's head and judge the South harshly. One has to judge the South, certainly, but the Northerners are not paragons of virtue on race relations either. But that said, to suggest that the Civil War isn't, in the end, very much tied up with slavery, I would argue that it absolutely is, and that's the argument you would get from professional historians.
Well, and so let me ask a follow-up question, because we're talking about the war, and this will be the last really question I ask about the Civil War and that period. Would those secessionists today be considered heroes, or would they be traitors if they were trying to succeed today, whether it be the South or the East? If they were trying to succeed from what we call our perfect union, what would they be labeled as today, according to historians or individuals who are looking at a group of people wanting to do away with our current form of government or states' rights? How would we view those individuals today? And that's for anyone.
Probably depend on where you were on the political spectrum in lots of ways. You know, the heroes, traitors certainly applied to the Civil War. You know, when I'm talking about history, I tend to try to avoid those kinds of terms. There's every reason to believe that people who were fighting on both sides believed they were fighting for real reasons that meant a great deal to them. There's no question about that. But that doesn't mean looking back. We have to look back with a certain humility to a different time. But we still have to make historical judgments about how do we make sense of what happened here. So I might avoid hero or traitor. Maybe the word rebel is the right word to use. But it's hard to imagine exactly what form that would take in 2015. I guess Rick Perry talked about taking Texas out of the Union and other things. To me, that sounds odd and strange in 2015. So I'm not sure which word I'd use. I don't know. But I would tend to avoid a label that goes too extreme. I guess I'd want to be more analytical and kind of think about what are the motivations here.
I appreciate that.
And I think you know, a number of people could have a number of different thoughts about that and make different judgments. I think that when we look at this, we've got to understand that in reality, you know, we don't know what each and every individual's thinking was. We know what we think it was. We can interpret what we think it was based on what we were told. But so I don't know that we can make those kind of judgments, but we do know that there were some real concerns with the racism issue, with the slavery issue. But not all slave masters were necessarily one and the same either. So, you know, there were some slave plantations where the slaves were treated differently than others. So I don't know that we can make that kind of judgment on those individuals that were leaving. And, you know, a lot of individuals, I think, got involved in the war, not necessarily because they wanted to, because they maybe didn't feel they had any choice.
Or they were drafted.
Right.
Right.
On both sides.
Are you looking at modern day secession versus the
Well, just
1860s?
if we looked at it through the lens of 21st century people wanting to leave what we would call the United States of America and form their own country within our borders, what would we call those people today based on what happened back in 1860s?
If you're looking for labels, I think that it'd be a very difficult call. And the reason I say that is because of the reasons they're going to leave. They want to leave, they want to form their own country because of, and I think you'd have to look at the reasons. And I think from our perspective over here, it might be initially, well, if you want to leave, so be it. If Texas wants to leave, it ruins University of Oklahoma's football schedule, you understand. But if you want to leave, leave. And then others are going to say, you can't do that because we fought this fight 150 years ago and you cannot leave out of here. What's your reason for that? What is divisive? And I think you'd almost have to look and see, if you're going to put a label on it, what's driving these people out over here, and why is it that you have to leave over here? What is it that's the conflict that we cannot resolve over here so that we can work together for the future?
Well, and part of what we think we have to keep in mind, I think, is Texas is not going to leave, right? you know, states don't go. I mean, people
leave.
make an argument and people choose to
Right.
do things, but I presume there are 10 million or more Texans, or many more Texans than that would not want to go. So some of this, of course, and the same was true, by the way, in the South. You know, West Virginia breaks off from Virginia. The eastern mountains of Tennessee were Unionist counties. The same is true in the North. There are people who felt like the war wasn't worth fighting, and of course there's some issues of criticism that happen on both sides, and that's inevitable in this sort of situation. So it's kind of hard to imagine exactly what what would happen in 2015 that would lead to this. But it's important to remember that even in states of the Deep South, not everybody agreed with the idea of seceding. They preferred some other way of dealing with this, you know, crisis, we might call it, that happens in 1860.
So let me get back to our initial piece, and that being the flag. Should it be flown on federal buildings? Should the Confederate flag be flown on state or federal buildings today? And I'll just start with the state buildings, because we have places like South Carolina, we have places in Mississippi where it's being flown. Should that flag be flown today?
From my perspective, we look at that battle flag as an appropriate place in history. And it belongs associated with the events of the Civil War. I think it's appropriate at the battlefields, where the Gettysburg, Vicksburg, where those battles took place, because that was the battle flag under which those troops fought. We use the battle flag when we do, one of the things that we do for our SCV group is that we have ceremonies for the Confederate soldiers, and we place that battle flag as a remembrance over there because that individual fought under that flag. We do the memorial service at Rock Island after the national service because it was a POW camp up there. We put those flags out, we do a service over there. I think it belongs there. Reenactments, certainly, it belongs over there. That's my feeling, and you asked personally, and that's the feeling of the group and of the organization. That's the place where it belongs. And I'm not going to tell, I think Branstad was quite right. I think the people of South Carolina had to make that decision. Is that an appropriate place for it? And to the extent that, what does it reflect? Why is it there? Why are you flying that? So there's a place for it in history, and I think it needs to be there, and that's how I would address that question over there.
Thank you. And I agree. I think that it belongs in museums. It belongs in places with history, like anything else from history. All the history doesn't have to be on the state building, on the federal buildings. I don't think that's the appropriate place for it. I think the appropriate place is in a museum, in places where records of history and items of history are stored. I think that we've got to look at the history of the flag and understand that the flag also changed over years. The flag changed after the Brown versus Board of Education. Wallace changed the flag too, when he wanted to present his sort of supremacy issues. So the flag changed through history and became more of a negative thing than really a positive thing in how it was used in history. And the Ku Klux Klan and many people continue to use it in a very negative, destructive way.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, part of making sense of it in these southern capitals is understanding when it arrived on the state grounds in the first place. And it's generally in the 50s and the 60s. It's 1956 that Georgia incorporates that emblem on its state flag. It's 1961 when it begins to fly over the state capitol in South Carolina. And the timing tells us something about the motivations, that this had much to do with, as it was defined by white Southerners at the time, massive resistance to the civil rights movement, which was attempting, of course, to alter and change the legal system of white supremacy in the South. So as sort of a historical judgment, I think it's important to understand that when it goes up tells you something about motivations. And those motivations, I think, are deeply problematic when you talk about, it would be true in any state, but when you talk about states where there are large percentages of the population that are, for example, African American. 29% of South Carolina is an African American population. 38% of Mississippians are African American. What are the implications of arriving at the state government where you are represented and where the courts sit, and this emblem that has been used throughout the 20th century as a symbol of white supremacy in the South and resistance to civil rights, your rights as a white or as a black Southerner, I should say. It's deeply problematic. So I would agree that this movement, it has to be, the decision has to be made at the state level, but this movement away from having the emblem on state grounds, state capitol grounds, I believe is a good one. I will say, as an historian, I'm surprised that it's happening and happening this quickly. I would not necessarily have predicted that it would happen this quickly, but personally, I think it's probably the right thing to do, and I'm glad to see it happening.
And so one final question, because we only have a couple minutes left. How do we resolve the issue amongst the groups? And I know short answers aren't going to be sufficient, but if you could quickly, how do we resolve the issues amongst groups to get better understanding and kind of move beyond it being a symbol of hate or it being misconstrued as a symbol of hate, starting here?
I think we're looking at the fact that we have an educator. Where does this answer lie? The answer lies in our classrooms. The answer lies in our organizations, recognizing the purpose and the use of that flag, what it means, and understanding the history. And I think if you do that, if we emphasize that, if we all take that role and we all take that responsibility, we talk a lot about our rights, but we have a responsibility to educate our people, everyone, about the use of that flag, what it means, what it stands for, and where we need to be. Because we do not need a repeat of that event that happened 150 years ago. Now, that's my short answer. It starts with education, and everybody has to be involved.
And I think I agree with that. I think if you look at what happened in Vinton, they made an agreement to accept, there are some positive negatives with the flag, but we have to respect other people's feelings, and just my right to freedom of speech should be considered, but my right to freedom of speech should not threaten someone else, should not endanger someone else. And I think that's where they've come in Vinton. I think that's where they got to continue to come, and I think it's where our society's got to come, because we've got to recognize that this whole thing of racism is kind of like the Trojan horse in the United States, and endangers all of us when we cannot feel safe.
Race and race relations, it's been referred to as the original sin of American culture and American history. The land of the free, but of course with slavery embedded within it under the Constitution. It's bedeviled us for a long time. Cultures change slowly, but we have to keep talking, we have to keep educating, we have to keep thinking about these things. And the thing that ultimately is going to do it is human empathy, that when people look at each other and see fellow Americans and see fellow human beings who they care about, and in that case, if they come to understand that something is hurtful, whether it's the Confederate flag or something else, you check yourself and you go, I don't want to hurt anybody. Maybe I'm going to make a different choice with regard to that. It's slow and it's frustrating, but we haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to get there gradually.
Thank you very much, you three, for joining us today and such a lively discussion. We hope you enjoyed this program. And as you've heard today, we have to continue the dialogue. We have to continue educating ourselves, because this issue isn't going away if we're afraid to address it. So we thank you, panelists, for taking the time to discuss this, and thank you for joining us this morning on this thoughtful program. Good day.